For more than half a century, the world knew her as the woman who could make an entire nation laugh without ever raising her voice, a figure bathed in studio lights, standing confidently before a live audience, smiling that unmistakable smile that felt both generous and reassuring. Week after week, she ended her show with a small, almost imperceptible gesture, a gentle tug of her left earlobe, something audiences accepted as a quirky trademark, harmless, even charming. It became a ritual so familiar that few people ever questioned it. Yet behind that gesture was not comedy, but desperation. It was not an inside joke, but a lifeline. Long before she became a television icon, she had learned that laughter could be a shield and that silence could be dangerous. Now, at 92 years old, as the noise of applause has finally faded and the rooms around her have grown quieter, Carol Burnett is no longer hiding behind the role that protected her for a lifetime. She is admitting what many have sensed but never dared to confront directly, that the woman who spent decades holding others together was herself shaped by loss, fear, and an unrelenting responsibility to save the people she loved. Her story does not begin with fame or awards or curtain calls, but with a child waiting in the dark, listening for sounds that might signal safety or danger. It begins with the weight of being the adult in a room long before she was ready, learning how to read the air, how to sense when laughter could defuse tension, and how humor could buy a few precious moments of peace. The world saw confidence, but what existed underneath was vigilance. The world heard jokes, but what lived beneath them was survival. As she looks back now, she does not speak like a legend revisiting her triumphs, but like a witness returning to the scenes that never truly left her. She speaks of silence not as an absence of sound, but as something heavy, something that followed her from childhood into adulthood, into dressing rooms, courtrooms, hospital hallways, and eventually into a quiet house filled with memories. The suspicion that followed her for decades was not about scandal or secret vice, but about happiness itself. People wondered how someone so joyful could remain untouched by darkness, how a woman who gave so much light could avoid being consumed by shadow. The answer, revealed slowly and without spectacle, is that she never avoided it at all. She carried it with her, learned to live alongside it, and transformed it into something the world could accept. Even at the height of her success, there was always an invisible audience she was performing for, someone she needed to reach beyond the camera lens, someone whose presence mattered more than ratings or reviews. That small gesture at the end of each show was not for viewers at home, but for a single person who represented safety, love, and the possibility of endurance. It was proof that even when surrounded by laughter, she was still communicating with her past. Now, in the stillness of age, she acknowledges that her life was never a simple story of resilience rewarded. It was a long negotiation with pain, a constant effort to outrun patterns she did not choose, and a lifelong attempt to protect others from the very forces that shaped her. The public sees a queen of comedy reflecting on a remarkable career, but what unfolds is something quieter and far more unsettling. The realization that joy can coexist with grief, that strength often grows from fear, and that some people spend their entire lives saving others while quietly accepting that they cannot save everyone. This admission is not dramatic or explosive, but it lands with the weight of truth. It reframes every laugh, every smile, and every moment of applause as part of a larger struggle to keep darkness at bay. At 92, Carol Burnett is not revealing a secret meant to shock, but a reality meant to be understood, that the brightest figures are often those who learned early how to survive in the dark. Long before she ever stood beneath television lights or heard her name spoken with reverence, Carol Burnett's world was small, cramped, and heavy with uncertainty. The apartment she shared with her grandmother was not a place of dreams, but of endurance, a single room where every object had a purpose and every sound carried meaning. At night, the darkness pressed in so tightly that they sometimes left the closet door open just to let the hallway light spill across the floor, a thin line of safety cutting through the shadows. It was in that fragile glow that a young girl learned how fear settles into the body and how hope can survive in the smallest gestures. Her grandmother, the woman she called Nanny, became more than a caretaker. She was a refuge, a moral compass, and the only stable force in a childhood shaped by absence. Carol's parents were alive, yet unreachable, trapped by alcoholism that transformed affection into unpredictability. She learned early not to rely on consistency from those who were supposed to provide it. Instead, she watched closely, reading faces and tones, adjusting herself to whatever mood filled the room. Laughter became her instinctive response, not because life was funny, but because humor could soften danger and redirect attention. In that apartment, comedy was not entertainment. It was protection. While other children dreamed freely, Carol learned to calculate risk, to sense when a joke could ease tension or when silence was safer. Movie theaters became her escape, dark rooms where stories promised endings she did not see at home. Sitting beside Nanny, she absorbed the rhythm of dialogue, the exaggeration of expression, and the magic of transformation. Those films offered more than distraction. They offered structure, a sense that chaos could be organized into something meaningful. Yet even as she dreamed, reality pressed back hard. Money was scarce, opportunity felt distant, and the idea of higher education seemed like a luxury meant for someone else. When she was accepted into college, the achievement carried more fear than celebration. Tuition loomed like an insurmountable wall, and the familiar lesson returned that wanting something did not make it attainable. It was at this fragile crossroads that an encounter occurred which would later feel almost unreal in its timing. A stranger saw potential where Carol saw limits, offering not only money but belief, wrapped in conditions that demanded integrity and purpose. That moment did not erase her past, but it altered her direction. She carried the weight of that promise with her as she left behind the apartment, the narrow bed, and the constant vigilance. Yet departure did not mean release. The patterns of her childhood traveled with her, shaping how she navigated ambition and success. When she arrived in New York, she was not the polished figure audiences would later adore. She was tall, awkward, expressive in ways that defied conventional beauty, and unafraid to be strange. On stage, these qualities became assets, but offstage they reinforced her sense of being different, of not fully belonging. Broadway recognized her talent quickly, but recognition did not quiet the inner voice that told her security was temporary. Success felt conditional, something that could vanish as easily as it appeared. When television executives questioned her place, suggesting limits she should accept, it echoed a familiar message from her past. Once again, she was being told what she could not do. This time, however, she refused to listen. Betting on herself was not arrogance, but necessity. She understood too well what happened when control was surrendered. Creating her own show was an act of defiance rooted in survival, a way to build an environment she could manage, filled with people she trusted, where laughter was intentional rather than reactive. On screen, she projected warmth and confidence, inviting audiences into a space that felt safe and generous. Behind the scenes, she maintained discipline and structure, aware that chaos could reemerge if left unchecked. Her connection with the audience was genuine, yet carefully held, a balance between openness and self-preservation. Even as her fame grew, she remained tethered to her origins, guided by the lessons learned in that apartment. She knew how quickly stability could fracture, how easily admiration could turn to scrutiny. This awareness fueled her relentless professionalism and her insistence on kindness within her creative circle. She did not confuse success with healing. The wounds of her childhood did not disappear with applause. They informed her choices, her boundaries, and her deep fear of repeating history. The world saw a woman who seemed effortlessly joyful, but beneath that image was someone constantly managing risk, guarding against collapse, and carrying the responsibility of being strong not only for herself, but for those she loved. This past, layered with poverty, addiction, and improbable rescue, did not simply precede her fame. It defined it. It explains why laughter was never casual, why connection mattered so deeply, and why the idea of family would remain both sacred and dangerous throughout her life. By the time the world believed her life had settled into something untouchable, a quiet crisis was already unfolding behind closed doors. Fame had given her control over the stage, but it had not given her immunity from the patterns she feared most. As audiences continued to see warmth, humor, and reassurance, the most painful chapter of her life began not with scandal or headlines, but with subtle changes she could not ignore. Her daughter Carrie, bright and creative, began to drift in ways that felt terrifyingly familiar. It was not one dramatic moment, but a slow accumulation of warning signs, mood shifts, disappearances, and silences that echoed Carol's own childhood. She recognized the rhythm immediately because she had lived inside it before. The same uncertainty, the same dread of waiting for a phone call, the same fear that love alone might not be enough. This was not the kind of problem she could solve with discipline or humor. This was addiction, the enemy she believed she had outrun, now standing inside her own home. The experience stripped away every illusion she held about control. She had built a career on timing and structure, on shaping chaos and laughter, but this refused to be shaped. Every instinct told her to protect her child's privacy, to maintain the image of stability the public expected, yet silence felt dangerous. She understood that secrecy had nearly destroyed her parents and had scarred her for life. So she made a decision that was almost unheard of for someone in her position. She spoke openly. She acknowledged the struggle, not as a failure of parenting, but as a reality that demanded light rather than shame. This choice came at cost. Admitting vulnerability meant dismantling the image of perfection that had followed her for decades. It meant inviting judgment, speculation, and the risk of being misunderstood. But for Carol, the greater risk was repeating history. She chose honesty because she knew what denial could do. The battle was exhausting and unglamorous, filled with difficult boundaries, moments of heartbreak, and a constant fear of losing the person she loved most. Tough love was not a slogan, but a daily test of resolve, forcing her to stand firm even when it felt unbearable. Slowly, painfully it worked. Carrie fought her way back, and their relationship transformed into something deeper than mother and daughter. They became collaborators, allies bound by shared survival. Together, they turned pain into art, giving shape to memories that had once been too heavy to speak aloud. For a brief period, it felt as if the curse had been broken, as if the long shadow of addiction had finally lifted. That fragile hope made what came next almost impossible to comprehend. Just as life seemed to open again, illness arrived without warning. A diagnosis delivered with clinical detachment shattered the fragile peace they had built. Cancer does not negotiate, and it does not care about victories already won. Watching her daughter face this new enemy was a cruelty Carol could not rationalize. Addiction had at least offered the illusion of choice, the belief that recovery was possible. This was different. This was relentless. Hospital rooms replaced rehearsal spaces, and conversations once filled with creativity narrowed to treatments, scans, and waiting. Carol stood beside Carrie not as a performer or a public figure, but as a mother confronting the unbearable. She had spent her life being strong for others, but nothing had prepared her for the helplessness of this vigil. The roles reversed in quiet moments when Carrie comforted her, reminding her that love still existed even in the face of loss. When the end came, it arrived not with spectacle, but with devastating finality. The promise Carrie made, to send a sign, lingered like a thread connecting the living and the dead. In the aftermath, silence returned in a new form, heavier than any Carol had known. Applause could not reach her here. Awards meant nothing. The world continued to see a legend, but inside she carried a grief that did not soften with time. Years passed, and just as she learned to live alongside that loss, history threatened to repeat itself once more. Addictions surfaced again, this time involving her younger daughter and the safety of her grandson. The realization was brutal. Despite everything she had done, despite every fight she had fought, the cycle had not ended. At an age when most people retreat from conflict, Carol stepped forward again, confronting the same demons with diminished strength but undiminished resolve. Seeking guardianship was not an act of control, but of protection, a refusal to let another child be swallowed by chaos. Standing before a judge, she was no longer the icon of television, but a grandmother reliving her own rescue decades earlier. The symmetry was haunting. The apartment had changed, the circumstances were different, but the core decision remained the same. Someone had to step in. Someone had to hold the line. This chapter of her life revealed the truth she would eventually admit aloud, that no amount of success can insulate a person from loss, and no public image can shield a family from pain. Her story was never about avoiding tragedy, but about meeting it again and again, choosing action over surrender even when the outcome was uncertain. In facing these events, she confronted the limits of her power and the depth of her love, understanding at last that survival does not mean victory, but persistence. The consequences of everything she endured did not arrive all at once, nor did they announce themselves loudly. They settled slowly into her life, reshaping her days, her relationships, and the way she understood strength. After the loss of her daughter, the world expected resilience, a graceful return to normalcy, but grief does not follow expectations. It alters time. Days stretched longer, nights grew heavier, and the familiar rhythms that once grounded her began to feel distant. She continued to work, to appear, to speak when required, yet something fundamental had shifted. The laughter that once flowed easily now required effort, not because it was false, but because it carried weight. Every performance, every public moment existed alongside a private reality that never truly left the room. Friends noticed a new quiet in her, a stillness that did not signal weakness, but a deep internal recalibration. She had learned to live with pain rather than push it away. The loss affected more than her emotional world. It reshaped her understanding of purpose. Achievements that once felt monumental now seemed fragile, even irrelevant, when measured against the absence that defined her life. She did not reject her career, but she no longer leaned on it for validation or escape. Work became something else, a means of connection rather than proof of worth. In conversations with those close to her, she spoke less about success and more about time, about how quickly it moves and how little control anyone truly has. The public still saw warmth and generosity, but beneath that was a woman who had accepted that some wounds do not heal, they integrate. The decision to seek guardianship of her grandson brought these truths into sharper focus. It required confronting her own limits while refusing to surrender responsibility. The legal process was emotionally taxing, not because of publicity, but because it forced her to relive patterns she had spent a lifetime trying to escape. Each hearing, each document, each moment of uncertainty echoed her own childhood, when safety depended on someone stepping forward. This time, that someone was her. The strain was visible to those who knew her well. She tired more easily, her patience tested by the demands of age and circumstance, yet her resolve did not waver. She understood that the cost of action was high, but the cost of inaction was unthinkable. The experience changed her relationship with fear. Where fear once triggered vigilance and control, it now existed alongside acceptance. She no longer believed that doing everything right guaranteed protection from harm. What mattered was showing up, even when outcomes were uncertain. This shift influenced how she related to others. She became more candid, more willing to acknowledge vulnerability without framing it as failure. Younger performers who sought her advice found not a mythic figure dispensing wisdom, but a woman who spoke honestly about regret, endurance, and the importance of asking for help. She did not romanticize suffering, nor did she deny its presence. Instead, she framed it as part of a larger human experience, something that binds people rather than isolates them. The ripple effects extended into her private relationships. Friends described a deeper intimacy, conversations that lingered longer, silences that felt shared rather than awkward. She listened differently now, less inclined to fix, more willing to witness. This presence became one of her quiet legacies, a counterpoint to the larger-than-life image that preceded it. Even the public perception of her began to shift, not through scandal or reinvention, but through subtle acknowledgement of her humanity. Interviews carried a different tone, one less focused on nostalgia and more on reflection. She spoke of forgiveness, not as absolution, but as release, a way of loosening the grip of anger and guilt that served no one. The cumulative impact of her experiences also altered how she viewed responsibility. She no longer believed in the idea of the solitary savior, the notion that one person could or should hold everything together. This realization did not diminish her sense of duty, but it softened it, allowing space for shared effort and communal care. The woman who once shouldered everything alone now understood the value of letting others stand beside her. Yet even with this evolution, the weight of what she had lived through remained present. There were moments, quiet and unobserved, when grief surfaced without warning, triggered by memory or absence. She did not fight these moments. She allowed them, knowing that suppression only deepened the wound. In accepting the long arc of consequence, she found a different kind of strength, one rooted not in endurance alone, but in honesty. Her life became a testament to the reality that impact is not measured solely by what one achieves, but by how one responds when achievement offers no refuge. Through loss, responsibility, and relentless challenge, she emerged not unscarred, but grounded, embodying a resilience that did not deny pain, but carried it forward with intention. There were many moments that never reached the public, fragments of her life that unfolded far from cameras and applause, where the true cost of endurance revealed itself quietly. In private, she developed rituals that helped her survive the spaces between responsibilities, small habits that anchored her when grief threatened to pull her under. She would sit alone in familiar rooms long after guests had gone, allowing the silence to exist without rushing to fill it. Silence, once something she feared, became something she learned to negotiate with, not as an enemy, but as a presence that needed acknowledgement. Friends who visited during these years noticed how carefully she listened, how she allowed others to speak without interrupting, as if she understood that pain often needed room more than solutions. There were nights when sleep came late and memories arrived uninvited, scenes from the past replaying with unsettling clarity. In those moments, she resisted the urge to retreat into distraction. Instead, she confronted the weight of what she had lived, understanding that avoidance only postponed the reckoning. She spoke rarely about these internal battles, not out of secrecy, but because she had learned that some experiences lose meaning when overexplained. What mattered was how they shaped her actions. She remained deeply committed to helping others, honoring a promise made decades earlier. Yet she did so with less visibility, preferring quiet gestures over public declarations. Acts of generosity were deliberate and personal, offered without expectation of recognition. Those who benefited often did not know the source, only that help arrived when it was most needed. This discretion reflected a deeper shift in her values, a move away from performance toward authenticity. In conversations with trusted friends, she admitted to regrets that surprised even those closest to her. Not regrets about career choices or missed opportunities, but about moments when fear had guided her decisions more than trust. She questioned whether there were times she could have listened more, waited longer, or acted differently. even while knowing that such questions rarely yield peace. These reflections were not expressions of guilt, but of humanity, an acknowledgement that love does not guarantee clarity. The story of her life, so often framed as triumph over adversity, contained countless instances of uncertainty that never resolved neatly. She carried these ambiguities with her, refusing to simplify them for comfort. Her relationship with faith and spirituality evolved during this period, shaped less by doctrine and more by experience. She did not claim answers, but she paid attention to moments that felt meaningful, coincidences that carried emotional weight. When signs appeared that reminded her of loss, she did not analyze them away. She allowed them to exist as reminders of connection, bridges between memory and presence. These moments did not erase grief, but they softened its edges, offering brief reprieves that felt both fragile and sustaining. In quieter conversations, she spoke about the exhaustion of always being strong, about how strength can become a role that others expect you to play endlessly. She acknowledged the loneliness that comes with being perceived as resilient, the way people assume you do not need support because you have survived before. This realization deepened her empathy for those who suffer quietly, especially caregivers and parents who carry invisible burdens. She became more vocal about the importance of acknowledging struggle without shame, even when solutions are unclear. These perspectives did not come from theory, but from lived experience, from decades spent navigating crises that offered no clean resolutions. Her creative impulses also changed during this time. Rather than seeking new stages or projects, she found meaning in mentoring, in offering guidance shaped by honesty rather than optimism. Young artists who approached her expecting encouragement instead received something more complex, a reminder that success does not eliminate pain and that fulfillment often requires confronting uncomfortable truths. She did not discourage ambition, but she reframed it, urging balance and self-awareness. In her own life, she learned to pace herself differently, respecting the limits imposed by age and circumstance. This acceptance was not surrender, but wisdom earned through repetition. The unseen chapters of her story reveal a woman who continued to evolve long after the spotlight dimmed, someone who understood that survival is not a single event, but a continuous process. She did not seek redemption or absolution, only understanding. Through private reflection, quiet generosity, and a willingness to sit with discomfort, she built a life that honored both joy and sorrow. These hidden moments, unrecorded and largely unknown, form the emotional backbone of her legacy, reminding us that the most profound struggles often occur where no one is watching. As the years accumulated and distance grew between the present and the moments that defined her, reflection began to replace urgency. The story of her life no longer felt like a series of crises to be managed, but a landscape to be understood. What emerged was not a neat moral or a triumphant conclusion, but a deeper awareness of what her journey represented beyond fame. The world remembered her for laughter, for a legacy of joy that shaped generations. Yet she came to see that her true contribution was something quieter. It was the permission she gave others to endure openly, to acknowledge pain without surrendering to it. In looking back, she did not separate success from suffering. She understood that they were intertwined, each shaping the other in ways she could not have predicted. Her achievements mattered, but not because they proved worth or resilience. They matter because they were built in spite of fear, not in its absence. This distinction became central to how she spoke about legacy. She rejected the idea that her life was inspirational simply because she survived hardship. Survival, she knew, is not rare. What matters is how one lives afterward, how one carries the weight forward without letting it calcify into bitterness. She spoke often of choice, not as control over events, but as control over response. This philosophy did not emerge from optimism, but from long observation. She had seen what denial could do, how it hollowed people out. She had seen what silence could cost. Her legacy, then, was not laughter alone, but honesty. The willingness to stand in contradiction, to be joyful and grieving, strong and uncertain, admired and deeply flawed. She also recognized that legacy is rarely something one defines alone. It lives in the lives touched, the conversations changed, the moments when someone feels less isolated because another person spoke truthfully. Letters she received over the years reflected this reality. People wrote not about jokes or sketches, but about recognition. They wrote about seeing themselves in her vulnerability, about finding courage in the fact that someone so admired had struggled too. These responses reshaped how she understood her public role. She was not a symbol to be preserved, but a human presence that could offer connection. This understanding softened her relationship with fame. She no longer felt compelled to maintain an image or defend a narrative. The pressure to perform dissolved into something more sustainable, an acceptance that her story belonged to others as much as it belonged to her. She did not correct interpretations or insist on understanding. She allowed space for meaning to shift depending on who was listening. This openness reflected a profound trust in the audience she had built over decades. It also reflected a release from the need to be strong in the same way she once had been. Strength, she realized, could be gentle. It could include rest, reflection, and the courage to say enough. Her reflections often returned to family, not as a source of nostalgia, but as a measure of what truly endured. Fame fades, recognition changes, but the impact of care, of stepping in when someone is vulnerable, leaves a different kind of mark. She saw her grandmother's influence more clearly now, recognizing that her own life had mirrored that quiet act of rescue in unexpected ways. The circle did not close neatly, but it held. In acknowledging this, she found a sense of peace that did not depend on resolution. The pain of loss remained, but it no longer defined every waking moment. It became part of a larger narrative that included love, effort, and continuity. She spoke of gratitude not as a denial of suffering, but as an acknowledgement that meaning can exist alongside it. This balance became the essence of her legacy, not the illusion of happiness, but the reality of perseverance without pretense. As she considered what would remain after her voice faded, she did not point to awards or milestones. She pointed to moments of recognition, when someone felt seen, when laughter offered relief, when honesty opened a door. In that sense, her life became a bridge rather than a monument, connecting pain to understanding, isolation to shared experience. This is what she ultimately left behind. Not answers, but permission. Permission to feel deeply, to survive imperfectly, and to continue even when the path forward is uncertain. When a story finally reaches its quietest point, there is no dramatic closing scene, no final punchline, no curtain call that ties everything together. What remains is a woman sitting with the sum of her life, aware that endings are rarely clean and that meaning is something we assemble slowly, long after the noise has faded. Her journey does not resolve into a lesson that promises comfort. Instead, it leaves behind an emotional afterimage, a lingering sense that strength is far more complex than the world likes to admit. She understands now that being the one who holds others together often means learning how to live with unanswered questions. There are losses that never make sense, moments that resist explanation, and regrets that cannot be undone. Rather than fighting these truths, she has learned to coexist with them. This acceptance does not dull the pain, but it prevents it from hardening into despair. The public may remember her for laughter, but what defines her in these final reflections is endurance shaped by compassion. She does not frame her life as a victory over tragedy, because tragedy was never an opponent that could be defeated. It was a constant presence, changing form but never disappearing. What mattered was the refusal to let it erase love. She chose again and again to respond with care, even when care came at a personal cost. In doing so, she challenges the idea that resilience must look triumphant. Sometimes resilience is simply continuing to show up, even when the outcome is uncertain and the reward invisible. The legacy she leaves behind is not an instruction manual for survival, but an invitation to reconsider how we measure it. Her life suggests that it is possible to be deeply wounded and still generous, profoundly tired and still present, uncertain and still loving. She does not offer hope as a promise that things will turn out well. She offers hope as a practice, something sustained through attention, honesty, and the willingness to stay engaged with life even when it hurts. In reflecting on everything she has lived through, she does not ask for sympathy or admiration. She asks for understanding. Understanding that people are rarely what they seem at first glance, that joy can coexist with grief, and that laughter is sometimes a form of courage rather than denial. She invites us to look more carefully at the people around us, to recognize that strength often hides in plain sight, and that those who appear most capable may be carrying the heaviest loads. Her story encourages a softer way of seeing, one that values presence over perfection and empathy over judgment. In the end, what lingers is not a list of accomplishments, but a feeling that survival is not about becoming invulnerable, but about remaining open. That love does not guarantee protection from loss, but it gives loss context and meaning. That the act of caring, repeated over a lifetime, leaves a trace that outlasts applause. As her voice grows quieter and her story passes into memory, the question she leaves behind is not about fame or success, but about how we choose to live with what we cannot change. Will we retreat, or will we stay connected? Will we hide behind roles, or will we allow ourselves to be seen? Her life suggests that even when the night feels endless, connection remains possible, not because pain disappears, but because we share it. This is the final truth she offers, not as a conclusion, but as a continuation. That none of us are truly alone in our struggle, and that acknowledging this may be the most human act of all.